Hello, welcome to the video everyone. We'll be going over the recent ban announcements and alchemy changes. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you could, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and give us a follow on Twitch for the live content. Just recently, Wizards has announced a ban list for the standard format, as well as the Legacy and Historic. And I figured it would be a good idea to quickly go over those, since those are going to be taking place by Thursday. This does mean that there are some big changes to the format for Standard at the very least. For Legacy, there's also a bit of a change with the banning of a specific card. I'm not too sure how impactful the Historic format is with the adjustment of bringing back one of the cards off the ban list, but it is getting a rebalance thanks to the rulings on how they work with alchemy. And they are banning another card for it as well. So to jump into the announcements, for the standard format, as of Thursday, everyone's favorite card, Alrund's Epiphany, is getting banned. And this has been probably for a long time coming. That a lot of people have been asking to have something done to this card, as it's been making the format very stale. It leaves you with the idea that you are running a deck that is either a hard control deck to be able to answer the Alrund's Epiphany deck, or you're running a deck that just runs fast enough that you don't ever have to worry about them casting the Alrund's Epiphany. Meaning most mid-range decks, we're not really seeing any play, as the Alrund's decks just make it so that they couldn't compete. With the banning of Alrund's Epiphany, we will probably see another shift in deck diversity. But that's not the only card that's going to make the deck diversity happen here. We are going to see a ban on Divide by Zero. Now, I'll be honest, this one I was not expecting. It is a card that's kind of annoying to deal with, but it's the same as dealing with any counterspell. With the shift of this, I think they were trying to do is make it so that way the leer decks didn't have a way to just play this creature on board and be able to protect it, as well as have answers against all types of spells, and get so much extra value from being able to play this from hand and from graveyard. And I'll be honest, Divide by Zero is a strong card, but I also think it's one of the very few cards that's making the learn lesson mechanic really viable. Now, does this mean like you'll never see anyone use the learn lesson mechanic? No, because there's still people who are going to be playing the eye twitches and sacrificing to get lessons, as well as the few black-white players that are running the couple other lesson cards as well. But I do think that this does mean that blue's no longer using learn, because this was really the only strong learn card in blue. Again, I think it's literally just they decided to ban this just to nerf the leer decks. Outside of that, I don't see a reason why they would have banned Divide by Zero. Moving on to the actual big ban announcement for the standard format besides the Alrund's Epiphany, and that is Faceless Haven. Now, Faceless Haven is a card that's actually making it so that way all the monocolored decks have this really strong card to roll into if a board just ends up getting destroyed. So this will probably make it so that way mono white probably never bothers to splash snow mana again, because they are just not going to be able to rely on this Faceless Haven card as a alternate win condition because of just how aggressive it can be after a board wipe happens. The thing is, this also does stop people from going for the Book of Exalted Deeds combo. Now granted, that combo did fall behind on its popularity overall ever since they brought back Field of Ruin. With the Field of Ruin going back in the standard format, it did basically make it so that deck style did disappear, but there was fringe play of it. But with Faceless Haven being gone entirely now, you'll probably not see a Book of Exalted Deed decks anymore, unless someone's just trying to have some fun where they're actually trying to use it in a fair sense for the actual token generation. But this does mean that you'll probably see a decline on decks that are just running snow sources in general. You'll still see snow sources used for people who are playing Blood on the Snow or similar spells, but you might see a decline on the green decks running it, with the exception of people still trying to just use the green specifically for Blizzard Brawl. Blizzard Brawl is really the only green card that's primarily seen used that requires the snow sources, and with Faceless Haven no longer being in the format, I think that the green may still just run the snow sources for it, but that's literally the only card besides Blood on the Snow that's really seeing any popular use that uses the snow mana. Moving on to the Legacy format, Ragavan is seeing a ban. If you're familiar with Legacy, this card is quite the terror, and is also quite the terror in the modern format. I'm not going to go over too many details about Ragavan just because I mostly focus on the Standard and the Alchemy format, but this is a big creature that does a lot of value and will probably be one of those cards a lot of people are either celebrating or sad to see go. And it is a very expensive card, so this does mean that you might see a little dip in price to the Ragavan card itself, but with it still being in the modern format, I don't think it's going to impact the price of the card too much. For the historic format for Arena, we are going to see a ban on Memory Lapse. It was suspended, but they decided to properly ban it, which means that people should be getting copies of the card refunded. I'm not entirely sure if they said in here that they were going to be doing that entirely, but in their article, you can actually read that the details of why they decided to ban the specific cards. And even the Divide by Zero, they said specifically right here that they were mainly just targeting the Lear decks or holebreaker horror decks to give that card a ban. But as for the Memory Lapse, they don't state anything about refunding, but normally when they ban a card, they give you refunds if you have the card. Lastly but not least, they also stated that Teferi, the Time Raveler, will be returning to the historic format, but not the Teferi that we know. Now, normally Teferi says each opponent can't cast spells. Each opponent can only cast spells anytime they could cast a sorcery. For the purpose of the rebalancing for the Alchemy format, they have adjusted him, and we will actually hop into the rebalancing notes. We'll start with the Teferi since we were just last talking about him. So we'll scroll down here to the bottom. And they changed it so that way now it's your opponent can't cast spells during your turn. And they also increased his mana cost from a 3 to a 4. But they also adjusted his loyalty up as well due to the increased mana cost. Now, I don't think they really need to increase his loyalty count, because he already is a card that does start off being able to impact the board when he comes on. But with the adjustment to saying that the opponent can still cast spells during their own turn at instant speed, it does mean it doesn't shut off all the combat tricks, and they can counter spells as well during their own turn. If they try to play something and they see a counter spell happening against them, they can now counter the counter if it's on their turn. So this is quite the nerf to Teferi the Time Raveler, but I do not believe that this means that the Time Raveler is unplayable. I do think he's still very possible to be played, but he's not going to be as oppressive as he used to be. So we'll actually hop into the Alchemy notes. In Alchemy, they're adjusting a number of cards. They're trying to make it so that way if you want to play a Dungeon Delver deck, they've tweaked a number of cards to try to make them more viable. First card that we have on the list is Archlich, the Archlich. They have adjusted it so that way when it enters battlefield. The adjustment to the card is that whenever it attacks, they remove the option for the opponent to sacrifice a creature on the attack trigger. So if you actually do manage to complete the Tomb of Annihilation and make it so that way this creature can stay on the board, whenever it attacks, create a number of 2/2 zombie creature tokens equal to the number of opponents you have is the only trigger now, instead of giving your opponent the option to sacrifice a creature or create a token. The next ability that's been adjusted is the Symbol from Parts. They lower the overall mana cost on it, now only requiring double black for the ability cost. I believe this one was originally, double black and one of any color, where it used to be 3 colorless and a black. So instead of being able to basically be 5 mana to activate this card in total, it now only costs 4 mana. The card itself did seem interesting, and I thought that it might be a card that might see some play. But since it is a rare card, and the Alchemy format is a little hard for people to want to invest too many cards specifically on, it has to be like a card that people are definitely sure it's going to impact game states. People probably haven't tried playing this one too much because you can't the only way you can get alchemy cards is opening packs or just crafting out of your rare cards. You can't draft and try to get these cards, which is why a lot of people, again, haven't been playing and testing certain cards. But Assemble for Parts, I think they're trying to see if they can develop some attention to, see if they can get some interest by making it so that way it's a little bit easier to play, or at least lower mana costs. That way, if you're like a mono black deck, you have better odds of playing it for value. Moving on, we have the Blood Rage Alpha, which I always thought was kind of weird that it had the option to use itself as a fight card, considering its original 3 toughness meant that it usually, if you had to fight anything, it just killed itself. They moved it to being a 4/4 for 4, which means that it actually is able to be a decent fight card itself. Other than that, nothing else has changed on this card, so we'll just move on. Back to the trying to improve cards for the Venturing deck. They have upgraded the Cloister Gargoyle here from a 3-drop 0/4 to a 0/3 for 2 mana. I do believe that this is an upgrade because it does mean that you can get this creature down much faster, get yourself a Venture trigger, as most of the Venturing cards do cost 3 or more mana to play. So it was kind of hard to venture into the dungeon at a quick pace. And with this adjustment, it does mean that the playing this as a 2-drop for a potential 3/3 flyer, as you venture into the dungeon quickly, means that I do believe that this might see play in the Alchemy format for those who want to try to play a Dungeon Delver style deck. The next card that received an adjustment is Dungeon Descent, and this card was terrible as a paper card. But by the adjustment that they did is they removed the enter battlefield tap status that it had. They also made it so that way instead of costing 4 mana and tapping it, it only now will cost 1 mana to tap it. But it will still require you to tap specifically an untapped legendary creature you control to venture into the dungeon. You may only activate this as a sorcery still, which is one of the other reasons why I don't think this card will still see any play. But with it only being a pay 1 tap it and not requiring it to enter the battlefield tap, you might see this actually go into a dungeon delving style deck. Moving on to the next card, they did adjust Ellie Wick here. And it was just a very small tweak. They made it that way instead of her ultimate requiring a -7, it only requires a -6 now. And with that adjustment, I do believe that it's more possible to actually play her to activate the ultimate on her. I don't know if that's enough really to warrant people wanting to try to play her in the Alchemy format, but it does make her, I guess, better in the overall sense. Nothing else has changed on her, but it is you have the potential of actually maybe getting off the ultimate, which only matters if you've actually successfully completed a dungeon. I'm just going to move on because I believe Ellie Wick, kind of interesting planeswalker, but not very strong, so I don't think anyone's still going to bother playing her. This card here for the Dungeon Delving deck might see some play with it only costing 1 black, but I still am not completely sure about this. So the card's Fate Reversal used to cost 2 mana, with it only costing 1 as a sorcery speed spell. What it does is it returns 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you venture into the dungeon. It's not a bad card, it just turns into an improved version of Raise Dead. So, it's simple as that, we'll move on. This card getting its upgrade actually does mean that it might actually see some play. Find the Path was originally a enchantment that tapped, made that way you enchanted a land. When it enters the battlefield, you venture into a dungeon, and it tapped for 2 green mana. With the adjustment for the Alchemy format, you can now get 2 mana of any one color. With this adjustment, it does mean that you have the color flexibility with this card, that you could actually potentially play maybe a black, white, green dungeon delving deck, and include Ellie Wick or other green cards with the black-white variants for dungeon delving. The reason why I make sure to specify the black-white is because I think black-white still has some of the best dungeon delving cards. Alright, so moving on, we have Puppet Razor. This, I did see a few decks trying to make use of it in some fringe play. I don't know if it will actually matter too much about this adjustment to it, where it goes from being a 4-mana 3/3 to a 3/4. It does say at the beginning of your end step, exile up to one creature card from your graveyard. If you do, you get to seek a creature card with mana value equal to the mana value of the card +1. This card perpetually gains menace. So what this does is, if you have a creature in your graveyard, say it was a 2-mana cost card, you exile it. You then get to take a card of mana value 3 from your deck at random and add it to your hand for a creature. So you can potentially set yourself up that you have like a nice arrangement of mana costs between your creatures, and make it so that way you can sacrifice your early creatures, get them in the graveyard, and upgrade them into other cards. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't seen too many people try to make use of this card in a way that truly comboed off, but I do see that it does have potential play. Alright, so on to the next card. Again, another dungeon delving card. Precipitous Drop. This is actually one of the best control spells that allows you to delve into the dungeon. Originally costing 3 mana, it was a little on the slow side, because if you hadn't successfully completed a dungeon, all it was a -2/-2 to a creature. But if you did manage to successfully complete a dungeon, it was a -5/-5, basically making it so that way it killed off most creatures, even through Indestructible. The only problem is 3 mana was a bit slow for the card. At 2 mana, this actually does mean that the card actually might see play outside of a Dungeon Delver deck, because 2 mana for a -2/-2 enchantment isn't terrible, and with the possible growth into a -5/-5, actually does make this a strong removal spell for the dungeon deck. It also allows for more like multi-spelling early on type play effects. And next in the cards for the dungeon delving, we're looking at the Tramp Adventure. To be honest, this card is already a very solid 2-drop, but they actually buffed the card, making it so that instead of being a 1/1, it's now a 2/1. So for 1 white, 1 black, you get a Death Touch creature that, as long as it's your turn, you get first strike, and whenever it attacks, you venture into the dungeon. Already, this card was actually really a good card, even as a 1/1. So they just decided to straight buff this card, try to make it so that way the venturing style decks just had a little more advantage to them, a little more power, and this is them buffing one of their strong cards to be even better. Alright, so we're going to move on to another card in the Alchemy format. So they're actually making an adjustment to Divide by Zero. Now, I'm actually not sure, but I think with the ban list, you're not going to be able to play Divide by Zero in the Standard Alchemy. But with this adjustment in the non-Standard Alchemy, which would be Historic format or the other versions of their formats that they actually use the Alchemy versions of cards, it'll still be able to do the exact same ability of return target spell or permanent with mana value 1 or greater to its owner's hand. The difference is you only get to learn if it was a mana value 4 or less card that you returned. So if you bounced a mana cost 5 or greater, you no longer get the learn mechanic. It is actually a bit of a nerf to the card, but most of the time people are interacting with the lower cost spells, so it's not a make it unplayable type card, and with it being mana cost 4 or less, it still hits a wide berth of cards that are important in the game, so I don't think that's really going to hurt it too much. Moving on, they actually did adjust the Fearsome Whelp to have a slight nerf to the card. So Fearsome Whelp was a 1/1 flyer that they now have given it haste as a slight buff to the card, but a big nerf to the card is that instead of it triggering at the beginning of the end step, it's now at the beginning of your upkeep. Each dragon card in your hand will perpetually gain this spell cost 1 less to cast. They realized that if the dragon deck goes first, they play a Fearsome Whelp, the mana cost reduction at the end of turn, most people could interact with it, and it would make it so that way you're often looking at a 4-cost dragon coming down on turn 3, with all the other dragons also still being permanently reduced. So To make it a little bit more fair and interactable for the opponent's sake, they made it so that way it's an upkeep trigger. That way, you're looking at, you have a potential, if your opponent goes first, you have a turn 1 and a turn 2 option chance to interact with this fearsome whelp. But you also have, you're on the play and your opponent happens to drop a fearsome whelp, you now have the potential of playing a 2-drop or a 3-drop against it. So it does actually nerf the dragon deck a bit in having some potential fair play aspects against it. But I do think that this is still a card that in itself is still going to be very strong, and this slight nerf does not make it unplayable at all. It's still very, very powerful. Moving on to the next card, we have the Holebreaker Horror that's been adjusted, and it does still do all of its crazy nonsense, but they remove the this spell can't be counter-tagged from it. So this does mean that the matchup of control against control, Holebreaker Horror actually has a more of a downside, and isn't a case of who draws Holebreaker Horror first can win in the control matchups. Moving on, Inquisitor Captain, everyone's favorite combo piece, has received a slight nerf in the sense that it only triggers now if you cast it from your hand for the enter battlefield trigger, instead of a just simply enter battlefield. This will be a huge nerf to the card because no longer will you be able to go from an Inquisitor Captain into a Glasspool Mimic and get the triggers. But also in the historic format, this also means that you can no longer use Soul Herder to keep triggering the card. So it is a big nerf to the card. Does it stop it from being a strong card in the format? No. This will still probably see plenty of play. This will still probably be a very strong card, and I don't see a reason why people would stop playing it. But it does prevent people from getting basically the explosive turns of Inquisitor Captain to a Glasspool Mimic into a Glasspool Mimic and just explode the board with playing one card to get like 4 bodies on board. We also have on the list here for the Alchemy format, Lear is getting a nerf, and this level of nerf probably makes Lear almost unplayable in what most people would think for the Alchemy format. What this does mean that is, even in the historic format, they force you to use the Alchemy versions of cards. So this actually probably makes Lear unplayable for historic, but also makes her very hard to play in the standard historic, by making it so that way the flashback ability is only during your turn. This means you no longer can play out all your fading hopes and divide by zeros, let them sit in your graveyard, and then be able to protect your Lear with those spells during your opponent's turn. It does mean that you have to actually make sure to hold copies of those in your hand to protect it during your turn, and try to get the value of playing all these spells also only during your turn. I do think Lear will still be a very strong card, but it does mean that Lear will be answerable. You will be able to get rid of it with destroy spells, so long as, you know, the opponent's not holding up the cards actually in hand to protect it. They can't just rely on the graveyard. Next card on the list is Sanguine Breaststroke. So you get all the normal value you would get out of this card. The only difference is whenever you sacrifice the blood tokens, instead of making it so that you make your opponent lose a life and you gain a life, you now just only make your opponent lose a life. This is a bit of a hit against the card for those who actually decide to go with the blood token sacrificing builds, because you no longer are draining your opponent and getting life back off of it. But it does mean that you have they went with the idea that they wanted to nerf the card a bit because of the common practices of playing Sanguine Breaststroke and then like using Meat Hook Massacre and getting a massive drain against the opponent thanks to the Blood Artist and Meat Hook Massacre drains. But because that gave you so much extra life, they wanted to try to make it so that way the Breaststroke itself, when you sacrifice your blood tokens, didn't give you the life back as well. So that way you are not getting an unfair drain level against your opponent in the long run. Now, I do think Sanguine Breaststroke probably did need a little bit of a nerf because the sacrificing life drain decks are a little too strong. I'll be honest though, I think what they probably should have done is actually probably just adjusted the Blood Artist to make it so that way you didn't get the life drain, where you only made them lose life that way. Because I think that's actually the more abusable part of the card. But If you did that, I don't know if the deck would survive, but I do think it's an interesting way that they decide to adjust this card. Do I think that people will stop playing it? No. I think people will still play this the exact same way they currently are, and we'll still be seeing lots of value from it. Next up is the Town-Raiser Tyrant. Town-Raiser Tyrant is getting a small nerf in the sense that it now can only target non-basic lands. You can't target the basic lands anymore. Everyone is already playing non-basic lands in all their decks. So I don't think this is really going to hurt the options Town-Raiser Tyrant is going to hit. But for some reason, their excuse on why they're doing this, they are trying to promote more monocolored decks in the Alchemy format. And all I can think is, monocolored decks, while, yeah, it's okay. It's interesting seeing a monocolored deck every so often. I always find multicolored decks more interesting because you see all these potential diverse colors and things being played, that I think that their excuse for doing this adjustment is awkward, because I think multicolored decks are typically more interesting. Monocolored decks really only get to do one type of thing, and I'm not sure that that's a good reason to do this adjustment. But it does make monocolored decks stronger against this, even though monocolored decks already typically do run non-basic lands in the form that almost everyone's running some type of land that can turn into a creature, or they're running like a Field of Runes where they can destroy such type cards. But it is a nerf to the card, but I don't think it's going to be a nerf that's going to make this card unplayable in the slightest. I mean, still, it's a 4-mana 4/4 flying dragon. It's solid on that end alone, and restricting it to only non-basics means that you're not likely still to miss on the turn 4 play or even the turn 3 play of hitting a target for this. It does mean, though, that if you are playing non-basic lands in your deck, you may want to try to avoid playing them within the first couple turns if you know you're against the dragon deck, just because of this adjustment. And the last card, again, was the Teferi Time Raveler, which we had already gone over. So that basically is the adjustments to the announcements from Wizard for the Ban Restricted and the Alchemy balances. These won't take place until Thursday, so try to enjoy the cards that you know while you can. I do believe the biggest nerfs have been to the leer, so you won't be seeing as many cards decks play around that. Inquisitor Captain getting the nerf it does make it a more fair card, but it's still a very strong card. You'll still see it played. Holebreaker Horror will still probably see plenty of play as well, but it will no longer be quite the blowout in the control matchup. Fearsome Whelp, with its adjustment, I don't think it's going to stop anyone from playing it. Same with Divide by Zero. I don't think anyone is necessarily going to think that the Dungeon Delving deck is going to become a competitive deck, especially once when you have to pair it against the Dragon deck. But with the adjustment to Precipitous Drop and the adjustment to Fearsome Whelp, you may actually see the Dungeon Delving deck be able to fight its way through a Dragon deck now. Other than those adjustments, let's see, was there one other card? Right, Blood Rage Alpha. I still don't think this is a very strong card, even with its adjustments. I do know some werewolf players, or wolf players in general, will play it. But I don't think... I think it's not a very fast card, and most of the time it ends up forcing you to trade a creature off, which is why I don't think it's that good of a card. According to the bans and restricted list, though, I do think with the ban of the Archlich Epiphany, as well as Divide by Zero, you're going to see a big shift on how a leer deck is played in general, if people are still going to try to play it. But with the complete banning of Archlich Epiphany, this completely destroys one deck idea entirely. You might still see people that will try to bring back red-blue dragons, but with the loss of Archlich Epiphany, I don't think that deck will be a competitive deck anymore. With the loss of Faceless Haven, Mono-White will still be a competitive deck, but I do not believe it's going to be as devastating as it was before. I do believe that with the loss of Faceless Haven, though, it does shift the power balance in favor of the black control decks, as well as the um, the white-black control decks as well, or even the black-green ones. Like, I think destruction control decks will now start getting more popular, but with the loss of cards like Divide by Zero and potential shift away from Lear, we'll probably see a big shift back into using control spell magic that involves counter spells again. But that's just a prediction. I'm not entirely sure how well that's going to work out. Thank you for watching the video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe for more content. If you'd like to join me while I stream, you can find me on Twitch, the link below. I hope to see you again in the next video, and have a nice one.